in the early 1930s, America was a nation gripped by hardship. The Great Depression cast shadows over nearly every household, yet in the midst of despair there stood figures of hope and admiration. Charles Lindbergh was one such figure. In 1927, his daring solo flight across the Atlantic made him an international hero, a symbol of courage and possibility in an uncertain era. His marriage to Anne Morrow, daughter of a prominent diplomat, only added to the public's fascination. They were young, attractive, and the very image of modern American success. When their son, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., was born in 1930, the press celebrated it like a royal birth. But what began as the storybook life of an adored couple would soon descend into one of the darkest chapters of American crime, a case that shook the world. On the night of March 1, 1932, that image of domestic tranquility was shattered forever when the Lindbergh baby was stolen from his crib in a secluded estate in New Jersey, plunging the family into a nightmare that would captivate the globe. That Tuesday evening began like any other. The Lindberghs were staying at their newly built estate in Hopewell, far removed from the bustling public eye that so often intruded into their lives. Anne had placed the 20-month-old boy in his nursery around 7:30 p.m., and the household settled into a quiet evening. But by 10:00 p.m., when the nursemaid went to check on the child, the room was chillingly empty. The window was ajar despite the cold air, and muddy footprints suggested an intruder. On the windowsill lay a crudely written ransom note demanding $50,000, 0 cents, in exchange for the baby's safe return. The handwriting was rough, the grammar broken, suggesting a foreigner. Charles Lindbergh, calm but visibly shaken, rushed into action. He phoned the police, friends, and even took charge of the investigation himself. Within hours, news of the kidnapping spread across the nation. What had begun as a personal tragedy for one family was now a collective trauma for an entire country. The Lindbergh baby was gone, and the race to find him had begun. Charles Lindbergh's fame meant that this was no ordinary missing child case. The aviator had lived his adult life under the blinding spotlight of celebrity, but never had that attention felt so invasive and merciless. His rise to fame had been meteoric. Just a few years earlier, he had been an obscure airmail pilot, then transformed overnight into an icon when he landed in Paris after his solo transatlantic flight. That same fame now ensured that his family's grief was laid bare for the world to see. Crowds gathered outside the Lindbergh estate, newspaper reporters camped on the lawn, and radio broadcasts breathlessly updated the nation. The kidnapping was not just news, it was a national obsession. But for Lindbergh and Anne, it was an intimate agony. Their son was gone, their home violated, and every hour that passed without word felt like a cruel eternity. The Hopewell estate, where the crime took place, had been intended as a retreat, a place where the Lindberghs could escape the relentless glare of fame. The house was still under construction, perched in a wooded area away from prying eyes. Yet the very isolation that promised privacy now made it vulnerable. The nursery was on the second floor, accessible by ladder from the outside. And on that fateful night, someone had taken advantage of that design flaw. Investigators would later reconstruct the path. A homemade wooden ladder propped against the wall, a broken shutter, and a carefully chosen window. The intruder knew exactly where to go and what to do, leading many to suspect inside knowledge of the estate. But in those early hours, speculation swirled faster than evidence could be gathered, and law enforcement struggled to contain the chaos. When the ransom note was studied, its peculiarities immediately stood out. It demanded $50,000, 0 cents, written in broken English with misspellings and odd phrasing. A distinctive symbol, 2 overlapping circles with 3 holes, was scrawled at the bottom, a sort of crude signature. Experts debated whether it pointed to a German or Scandinavian writer. For the Lindberghs, however, the only question that mattered was whether their child was still alive. Charles Lindbergh insisted on cooperating with the kidnappers' demands, hoping to avoid any action that might endanger his son. He believed that money was a small price to pay for his baby's life, and his influence ensured that every federal and state resource was poured into the case. But in the background, doubts lingered. The vagueness of the instructions, the strange language, and the sheer audacity of the crime all suggested something far more complex than a simple ransom plot. The local police were quickly overwhelmed. This was not an ordinary burglary or missing child report. It was a crime that had the entire nation watching. The governor of New Jersey called in the New Jersey State Police, while the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, offered assistance. Lindbergh, however, did not wait for bureaucracy. His military discipline and natural command drove him to take charge. He established a headquarters at his estate, reviewed every lead, and made decisions on who could be trusted. While his leadership inspired confidence in some, others worried it interfered with proper police procedure. Yet, in those early weeks, with his son's life at stake, Lindbergh's authority was unchallenged. This was not merely an investigation. It was a desperate father's crusade. As the investigation unfolded, the press frenzy only intensified. Reporters from across the country converged on Hopewell, and tabloids spun wild theories about organized gangs, foreign enemies, or disgruntled employees. Strangers showed up claiming to have visions or secret knowledge, while opportunists sent false letters offering to return the baby for money. Each new development was broadcast across the airwaves, making the case feel less like a police matter and more like a national drama unfolding in real time. For the Lindberghs, privacy was obliterated. Every facial expression, every word spoken to reporters was dissected by a nation desperate for answers. The kidnapping had transformed from a personal loss into a collective spectacle. Into this whirlwind stepped Dr. John Condon, a retired Bronx schoolteacher who offered his services as a go-between. Publishing letters in New York newspapers, he claimed to have established contact with the kidnappers. Surprisingly, the criminals responded. Through a series of coded messages and clandestine meetings, Condon, known as Jaffe, became the unlikely intermediary. Charles Lindbergh placed immense trust in him, even accompanying him on some nighttime drives to secluded locations where supposed contacts appeared. The negotiations dragged on for weeks, filled with cryptic notes, promises, and endless frustration. Yet each letter, bearing the same strange symbol from the first ransom note, convinced Lindbergh that they were on the right trail. Finally, after tense back-and-forth communications, a deal was struck. The kidnappers agreed to release the child in exchange for $50,000, 0 cents in small bills, with certain serial numbers recorded by authorities. On April 2, 1932, Condon delivered the ransom to a shadowy figure in a Bronx cemetery, following the precise instructions given in the notes. The man, described as foreign-looking and speaking with an accent, took the money and promised the baby was in a boat off the Massachusetts coast. Hope surged in the Lindbergh household as they clung to the belief that their ordeal was ending. But as days turned into weeks, no child was returned. The supposed boat was never found, and the ransom seemed to vanish into thin air. By early May, frustration and despair gripped the Lindberghs. The ransom had been paid, yet there was no word. Law enforcement combed through every lead, but all trails ended in dead ends. Then, on May 12, 1932, the nightmare reached its darkest moment. A truck driver walking near Mount Rose, just a few miles from the Lindbergh estate, discovered the decomposed remains of a small child. The body was identified as Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, likely inflicted on the night of the kidnapping. The nation that had waited in hope was now consumed by grief and fury. For Charles and Anne, the discovery ended all illusions. Their baby was gone forever. The investigation now shifted from rescue to justice. Authorities focused on tracing the ransom money. Bills with the recorded serial numbers began surfacing in New York, particularly in gas stations and local businesses. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Someone in the Bronx was spending the ransom bills, often to buy gasoline. Detectives intensified their surveillance, checking every reported bill, patiently waiting for a breakthrough. The trail was painstakingly slow, but relentless. In September 1934, more than 2 years after the crime, investigators finally made their arrest. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant and carpenter, was caught when a gas station attendant noted a suspicious gold certificate and alerted police. A search of Hauptmann's home uncovered $14,000, 0 cents of the ransom, hidden in his garage. Tools found in his possession matched the wood used to construct the kidnapping ladder, and handwriting experts claimed his script matched the ransom notes. For authorities, the case was solved. For the public, desperate for closure, Hauptmann became the face of evil. The trial that followed in early 1935 was unlike anything America had ever seen. Dubbed the trial of the century, it attracted thousands of spectators, reporters, and curious citizens to Flemington, New Jersey. Inside the courtroom, the drama was relentless. Witnesses testified to seeing Hauptmann in suspicious places. Handwriting analysts swore to his guilt, and the ransom money loomed as damning physical evidence. Hauptmann maintained his innocence, insisting the money had been left with him by a friend who had since died, but his story strained credibility. Charles Lindbergh himself took the stand, pointing to Hauptmann as the man he heard speaking during the ransom negotiations. The jury was enthralled, and the nation watched with rapt attention. In February 1935, Hauptmann was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Appeals were filed and supporters argued that the evidence was circumstantial, the trial biased by media frenzy, and that Lindbergh's influence had overshadowed the process. Still, the appeals failed. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair. Even as he went to his death, he proclaimed his innocence, leaving behind questions that linger to this day. Was Hauptmann truly the mastermind, or was he a scapegoat caught in the machinery of public outrage? The aftermath of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Out of the tragedy was born new legislation, commonly known as the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping across state lines a federal crime, ensuring the FBI could intervene in such cases. The law reshaped American criminal justice, granting new powers to federal authorities to prevent similar crimes. Yet for the Lindberghs, no law could mend their broken hearts. And they eventually left the United States, seeking privacy in Europe, away from the relentless gaze of the public that had both adored and intruded upon them. Even decades later, the Lindbergh kidnapping remains one of the most haunting crimes in American history. It was not just the loss of a child that captivated the world, but the collision of celebrity, media, and justice in a way never seen before. The case set precedents in law enforcement, raised enduring debates about fair trials, and embedded itself into the cultural memory. For every certainty, there remained doubts about the ransom negotiations, about the extent of Hauptmann's guilt, and about whether others may have been involved. These uncertainties ensured the story would live on, endlessly retold, forever unresolved in the public imagination. The tragedy also reshaped the Lindberghs themselves. Charles Lindbergh, once the golden boy of aviation, carried the scars of grief throughout his life. Anne, whose quiet strength sustained her through unimaginable loss, later wrote movingly of the ordeal in her memoirs. Together they built new lives, but the shadow of 1932 never fully lifted. Their story became a cautionary tale about fame, privacy, and the dangers of living under public scrutiny. To many, the Lindbergh kidnapping symbolized the fragility of security, the reminder that even national heroes were not immune to the cruelties of fate. Looking back, the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping was more than a crime. It was a cultural earthquake. It revealed the vulnerabilities of celebrity, the power of the press, and the depths of public emotion when innocence is shattered. It led to lasting reforms in law, shaped investigative techniques, and became a reference point for every kidnapping case that followed. But above all, it was the story of a child lost, a family devastated, and a nation forever marked by grief. Nearly a century later, the name still stirs recognition, and the questions still echo. Who truly climbed that ladder in Hopewell on that cold March night, and why? The Lindbergh baby's fate reminds us that history's darkest stories are not just about crime, but about the human cost left behind. It was the cost borne by two parents whose lives were forever broken, a justice system tested by the demands of a grieving nation, and a society grappling with the intersection of tragedy and spectacle. The story endures not only because of its mystery, but because of its profound impact, a reminder that even in moments of glory, shadows can fall swiftly, leaving wounds that never truly heal.